Slavery in America started in the early 17th century, or in other words, the 1600s. In 1620, the first ship of Africans was brought over from the Dutch over to the Jamestown colony, which is now present day Virginia, brought over primarily because they were a commodity known for their agricultural skills and farming expertise in the continent of Africa. And because there was so much work to do on the farms, many felt that they needed more workers to do the work, and they could purchase these human beings for cheap and a one-time fee as opposed to paying them like normal laborers. However, they overlooked a glaring fact that these were human beings and they were not machines. And slavery was needed more in the South due to the longer growing seasons. So because you could farm longer in the southern portions of what eventually became America, most enslaved peoples worked in the fields on farms, particularly harvesting tobacco, the rich, big money-making tobacco plantations in areas like Virginia and North Carolina. Now, in the North, because the growing season wasn't as long, you typically had about 6 to maybe 8 months of growing season. And then because of winter and colder climates, people were more indoors. You saw more servants, whether they were indentured servants who were working off a debt, and then once that debt was paid off, they could earn their freedom, or whether they were paid servants even. And some of these servants in the North were included in social gatherings. They could eat dinner with the enslavers. They could attend parties and other social gatherings, not in every place, but in some places. That took place primarily in the North, but they were used indoors and sometimes were known as house servants. In the South, primarily, to help create this authority over the enslaved, there were laws or rules called slave codes that were enforced, and they exhibited oppressive power on these enslaved peoples and put restrictions on their rights. So normal everyday rights like the right to own property, the right to vote if you were a male, the right to be educated, the right to have free will to choose what you wanted to do. These were not rights that were afforded to enslaved peoples, whether they were farmhands in the South or whether they were indoor servants in the North. There were still a lot of these slave codes which restricted what they could do and restricted a lot of the liberties that many people today enjoy. And many of these enslaved peoples were untreated or treated unfairly and treated as property rather than as human beings. And that was really the start of a lot of this toxic culture that we see still existing today, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So speaking of that, consequences of slavery. Many enslaved people were severely punished if they disobeyed an enslaver, or if they did their job poorly, or if they didn't do it to satisfaction, if they didn't do it on time. And in many sad cases, some enslaved individuals were punished just to send a message and to show other enslaved peoples this is what could happen if you don't follow orders. Many enslaved peoples were torn from their families and sold into work. So as a compassionate human being, as a father, as a loving family member with brothers and sister, and with parents who mean the world to me, the thought of this being separated from them for life because somebody else wants to use me to make money off of me, to split up probably the best bond that anybody can have, and that is the bond of family. This was maybe the most grave consequence of slavery. Enslavers did feed their enslaved individuals, their workers, to keep them healthy enough to do their job. So it would be like people today taking care of a machine for the sole reason of wanting that machine to do the work well. So taking care of a computer, taking care of a phone, taking care of a car. People who want to do that don't have a love for that device, but they want it to work for them. And so that's really one of the few forms of compassion that Southern enslavers showed to their enslaved individuals, their workers, was to feed them and to take care of them, to give them just enough rest to allow them to do the job that the enslaver wanted them to do. Other consequences of slavery, it led to a higher occurrence of poverty among Black individuals than whites throughout history. And it created this gap. And probably most prevalent was it led to this toxic culture of racism and oppression and some of the things that still are harboring negative thoughts today in our modern society. Now, enslaved individuals did not take it lightly. They did not just sit back and accept that this was their fate. They put up resistance, and resistance is basically fighting back, whether it's actively or inactively or passively. So to get out of work, the enslaved would destroy or hide tools that they were needed to do their work. So if you don't have the tools, you can't do the work. And so therefore, maybe it's some time off. They could fake illness, and sometimes they would even fake injury. There were accounts of enslaved people's breaking limbs of their own to prove to an enslaver that they could not do the job, so it would spare them the long toiling hours of being out in the sun and the heat with extreme conditions. Many would try to run away, even though they know that they risked punishment, and sometimes severe punishment, even death in some cases. Or they would act like they didn't understand the job or that they couldn't do it well enough, hoping that they might be replaced or given an easier task than the one that their enslaver had given them at the beginning. Now, there were also enslaved rebellions. Probably the most famous, the earliest rebellion of note was the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739. And this was a violent slave rebellion that was planned, where plantations were burned, enslavers were attacked, even some family members were attacked. And again, this was a work by the enslaved to send a message to other enslavers that if this is going to continue, then you're going to have rebellions, you're going to have blood on your hands, you're going to have possible destruction of property, and maybe even some damage to individuals, to people, some danger being brought. 20 white people were killed in the Stono Rebellion, and it was eventually confronted by a militia, meaning armed forces from local governments, and many from both sides died in this Stono Rebellion. The enslaved rebels who were not killed in the rebellion were captured and later put to death for fighting for their lives and fighting for their freedom. And because of this, key result was that slave codes became even more strictly enforced, and conditions of slavery became even more inhumane.